I now call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 99 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. As always, please remember to address all comments through the chair. Before we proceed, I again want to remind members and guests to be very careful when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbour's microphone is turned on. Earpieces placed too close to a microphone are one of the most common causes of sound feedback, which is extremely harmful to interpreters and causes serious injuries. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on June 16, 2022, the committee is commencing its study of population sustainability of Yukon salmon stocks. Welcome everyone. We have today on our first panel on Zoom from Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, we have Chief Nicole Tom. From Pacific Salmon Foundation, we have Stephanie Peacock, Senior Analyst. And in person, we have from Kwanlin Dun First Nation, Brandy Mays, Manager Operations and Fish and Wildlife, Heritage Lands and Resources. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have up to 5 minutes for your opening statement. And I'll go to Mr. Arnold. You guys hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just ask that we could carve out a few minutes at the end of this meeting to discuss some future committee work, if we could, towards the end of the meeting, and keep in mind that we could potentially be interrupted by the bells and a vote.
Yeah, well, if everybody sticks to the time, we'll get through our panels, and if there's 10 minutes or so left over at the end, we'll go back to you, Mr. Arnold.
Thank you.
So now again, we'll thank you for taking time to appear. You each have 5 minutes or less. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Brandy Mays for 5 minutes or less,
Monsieur
please.
le Président, excusez-moi, parce que vous n'avez pas vu ma main, mais
Yes, Madame Debienne.
je faisais des signes, mais
I don't think you saw my hand. I was waving, but you didn't see me. I would also like to discuss last week's motion. I don't know if we could do this quickly. We've already agreed on certain points, or if you think we could take a few minutes afterwards. But we could also do that before.
okay.
Okay, all right. So, Ms. Mays, over to you.
Shokatan Ni'i. It is good to see you. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land in which we gather is the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thank you to the committee for this opportunity to speak on behalf of Yukon River Chinook and my people. My name is Brandy Mays. I am a proud descendant of the Tagish Kwan people, the original people of Kwanlin Dun First Nation and Whitehorse, Yukon. I belong to the Ducklawiti clan, the Killer Whale and Wolf Clan crest. The clan crest assures me that I am part of the land and part of the water. As a beneficiary of Kwanlin Dun First Nation, my culture is who I am and where I come from. My family has lived at the headwaters of the Yukon River, Shutakwan, as we call it, and Marsh Lake for generations. Today, I am here in my role as Manager of Operations and Fish and Wildlife for Kwanlin Dun First Nation. I am also a Land Steward Officer for my First Nation. Additionally, I am the Canadian Co-Chair for the newly formed Yukon River Panel Traditional Knowledge Committee and First Nation Advisor to the Yukon River Panel. I have been involved in fish and wildlife management for over a decade with a focus on Indigenous knowledge, ethical harvesting, and land stewardship. The waterway, now called Miles Canyon to the Whitehorse Rapids, was well known to generations of First Nations people. Our ancestors called this area Kwanlin, which means running water through canyon in southern Shoshone. Not only was this section of the river an excellent area for fishing, but well-worn trails on the banks of the canyon tell the centuries of people traveling overland in search of game. The banks of the river were lined with fish camps, lookout points, hunting grounds, burial sites, and meeting places. Our values, language, and traditions are rooted in this land. The headwaters of the Yukon River were home to the Tagish Kwan and a regular meeting place for people and other First Nations to come to trade and fish. Life changed forever at the turn of the century with the building of the city of Whitehorse. Our people have a long history and have always had a relationship with salmon. Unfortunately, Yukon River Chinook salmon in Kwalendon First Nation traditional territory have been depleted to a point where our citizens have voluntarily reduced or completely withdrawn from harvesting salmon. This is one of the longest salmon migrations in the world. The impacts to our culture, our people's health, food security, the ecosystem, thereby bears, eagles, and others that depend on these returns is devastating. Pressures such as overfishing, ocean commercial bycatching, or commercial fishing, bycatch, climate change, predation, and other ecological factors have taken a toll on the Chinook returns. The 1958 completion of the Whitehorse Rapids Dam flooded our traditional fishing locations and put the productive and culturally important Mitchie Creek and McClintock River stocks in an uncertain situation. Now, the water use license for the Whitehorse Dam will expire in 2025. KDFN is involved in the process and engaging our community. We are working to ensure KDFN interests are represented and prioritized throughout the dam relicensing process. This includes the preservation or enhancement of KDFN environmental, cultural, and heritage values in the Southern Lakes region, as well as the health and well-being of the KDFN community. 2023, the Whitehorse fish ladder saw the lowest count in history, with only 54 Chinook passing through the ladder. The Takini River, a tributary to the main stem Yukon River, counted just over 350, nowhere near historical numbers. The collapse of the salmon population is one of the greatest challenges this region faces. We know that the Yukon River Panel and the governments of U.S. and Canada have a role in managing to the treaty obligation, but the current management model isn't working. Chinook have been managed to near extinction. The Alaskan ocean bycatch in the trawl fishery is impacting and intercepting vital Yukon River salmon, not to mention the impacts on the ocean habitat and ecosystem. Mass amounts of pink and chum hatchery salmon being put into the system is competing with the Chinook salmon food source. Our late elder, Louis Smith, said, "You must save the salmon. If it wasn't for salmon, we would have all starved. Now it's our turn to save the salmon." What are we going to do as a nation, Canada, to save the salmon? As a country, how do we rebuild these life-giving salmon when they are facing so many barriers? To rebuild a population that has been depleted to the point of near extinction is going to take every resource we have. It's going to take every effort we have. This includes all levels of government on both sides of the border. Stopping fishing is not enough. For Canada, we need to dig deep into the impacts of the Whitehorse generating station and its impacts on salmon, freshwater fish, animals, and habitat. Canada fulfills its treaty obligation to the Kwalendon Final Agreement under Chapter 16.3.22, the Whitehorse Fishway Redevelopment Project. Continue to provide capacity, money, and resources to the Yukon River Salmon Rebuilding Strategy. Continue to support Kwalendon on its feasibility and development of a salmon stewardship center that will support all Yukon First Nations in their rebuilding and restoration efforts, which is a gathering and teaching place, restoration and research hub, and a center for Chinook restoration. Work with Yukon First Nations and their governments to support cultural inclusion in the rebuilding strategy. Include equal inclusion of both traditional knowledge and science in all decision-making. This rebuilding plan has to include all levels of government, both international and domestic, and include the people who reside along the river and its tributaries. The salmon need this. It is not just science that has a role in how to recover these stocks. We need to recognize the people who have relied on the salmon since time immemorial, the people who have protected, who have had a relationship with our precious relatives for thousands and thousands of years. A commitment to ensuring our Yukon First Nation citizens and governments are engaged in a holistic and meaningful way. Collaboration to work together in honesty and respect, recognizing different government processes while keeping momentum alive and striving towards consensus and decision-making. Upholding our shared commitments to vital habitats of the Southern Lakes region and to our salmon. As Elder Louis Smith said, we must save the salmon. Salmon can be resilient if we give them a safe passage, clean water, a healthy habitat, a safe environment. Let's do this together, Canada. We need a wild river with wild salmon. These things bring purpose. It is our responsibility as governments, as First Nations, as Canadians, as humans. We take care of the
Ms.
river.
May,
we
I'm
feel
going to have to cut you off there. It's gone way over the 5-minute limit. Hopefully anything you didn't get to say will come out in questioning. We'll now go to Chief Nicole Tam from Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation for 5 minutes or less, please.
Akansanu Sothan. Danki ethi hede Sothan detsi uji, Kuchan ki Nicole Tam uji, Ine Eileen Rondo uji, Ite Roger Rondo uji, Itsua Grace Ferklo uji, Itzi George Ferklo uji, Hanjat Ichi, Masi Cho. I would like to acknowledge the attendants in the room who have gathered here to pay respects to the Yukon River in the efforts to calling the salmon back. As a Northern Shoshone mother from the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, respect for the salmon has been ingrained in my DNA since time immemorial. As a child, fish camp was the most significant cultural bond and identity that was transferred every year. Our family would gather, elders, children, youth, mothers, fathers, aunties, uncles, and our family bonds were solidified. Language, traditional laws, cultural values, and oral stories were transferred from one generation to the next. This was the center of the Northern Shoshone identity, tied to our keystone species, the Chinook salmon, and our keystone place, the Yukon River. There is a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual connection to a fish camp. The whole process from beginning to end is hard work. Physically, you are actively engaged with the water, setting net and carrying out various duties to run the fish camp. Mentally, you have time to reflect and concentrate on your well-being. You must be sober and in good mental health as to not pass on any negativity to the salmon preparation for your family. Emotionally, your cup is full of laughter, wisdom, joy, and love shared with the environment, salmon, and family. Spiritually, you are paying respects to the original agreements with the salmon by following your traditional laws and values. I quote from our history with regards to coexistence with other animals. Traditional law, doli, is the most sincere expression of respect that humans can offer. But what is respect? Consider the contrasting viewpoints of Northern Shoshone and modern science, where science views salmon as a simpler life form operating on basic instincts, much as a complicated little machine would do. Northern Shoshone consider salmon to be a distinct culture, a culture whose fortunes have been intertwined with the Northern Shoshone for countless of ages in intricate relationship that has not always run smooth. Crow, for instance, caught no salmon because he created a permanent barrier trap across the river. He had to learn his lesson. And the salmon people who were offended by by their treatment of humans, so they took the little boy to the ocean to teach proper respect. This then is how Northern Shoshone view salmon, not as primitive animals that are almost oblivious of humans, but as equals, as intelligent beings that are fully aware of their surroundings and what is happening to them, as persons who deserve the same respect as the Northern Shoshone would receive if that person were to give up their life for the survival of another. Thus it deeply pains us to witness any instances of disrespect to the good salmon, who we rely on every year for our health and well-being. We fear that their role in the rhythms of nature is being abused and an entire ecosystem is in jeopardy. By bringing back traditional knowledge, we are striving to redress this imbalance as we have done in the past, but we are no longer alone in this responsibility, and we desire that other cultures respect our concerns and work with us to achieve a more harmonious relationship with the salmon and all life. I was recently told a traditional knowledge story coming from the Alaska Territory of the elders knowing that there would be plenty of salmon when there were plenty of monarch butterflies. This traditional knowledge was new to me and it was never taught by my people. In curiosity, I researched the monarch butterfly and found that it became endangered in 2016. Soon after, our salmon declined drastically. So you see, the knowledge held within the peoples of the land are of value and can help restore the policies that detriment the ecosystem. The Yukon First Nations would like to bring attention to the devastation that we are feeling in our hearts to the decline of the Yukon River salmon. We ask that all parties engage in the habitat protection and attention to resources and capacity that is needed in order for the Yukon to proceed in this endeavor. We can no longer argue or dispute the reason why. We now must work in unity before the salmon becomes extinct. This tragedy is a direct threat on our inherent rights to harvesting. This alone makes the Northern Shoshone people question what has happened to make it so. The mismanagement of the international fisheries is an infringement on our treaty, which our forefathers sacrificed lands for the right to feed their families with healthy homeland foods. The treaty must be honored. Traditional knowledge tells us don't drag nets, don't mess with fish. These ancient laws have long been broken. We hold a responsibility to protect the rights of clean water and the sustenance to the future generations. We ask that Canada and the United States champion this initiative and that true reconciliation take place. Masicho for all your time.
Thank you. We'll now go to Stephanie Peacock, Senior Analyst with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. My name is Stephanie Peacock, and I'm a Senior Analyst with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. I am based in Whitehorse, Yukon, and joining you today from the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and Tanquatching Council. The Pacific Salmon Foundation is a non-government organization dedicated to the stewardship and conservation of Pacific salmon in BC and the Yukon. We invest in community-driven initiatives and lead science programs that help inform salmon conservation and management efforts. My area of expertise is in salmon population ecology, and my work centers around compiling and analyzing salmon-related data to understand the status of salmon in BC and the Yukon. Through that work, I have gained familiarity with the status and trends of Canadian origin Yukon Chinook salmon, which are not just a uniform group of fish, but comprise 12 genetically and ecologically distinct populations called conservation units. Each of these conservation units has a unique evolutionary history and is an irreplaceable unit of biodiversity. Conserving this diversity within Yukon Chinook is essential for resilience in the face of climate change. A recent study found that Yukon Chinook return migrations to Canada were 2.1 times longer and 1.4 times more stable through time than they would be if there was just a single homogeneous population. Unfortunately, the reality is that we have very little information on how most salmon conservation units are doing because the publicly available data on Yukon salmon is focused on border passage. There's not a single estimate in DFO's publicly available spawner database for any Chinook spawning in the Yukon since 2008. We need to improve monitoring and data availability at the scale of conservation units to be able to identify when and where actions are required to avoid local extinctions and loss of biodiversity. From the limited data that we do have, the recent declines in Yukon Chinook seem to be reflected across conservation units. Why are these salmon disappearing? There's no single cause, and the likely suspects are the usual: decades of habitat degradation and loss, in the Yukon mainly due to mining and hydroelectric dams, commercial fishing, and climate change. However, there are a couple of things that make Yukon Chinook unique. Canadian Yukon Chinook are the longest migrating salmon in the world, and this increases their exposure to threats in freshwater. In particular, with climate change, we are seeing unprecedented increases in river temperatures, which has correlated with reduced productivity of Yukon Chinook over the past 28 years. This does not bode well given the predicted impacts of climate change. Strategies to mitigate rising river temperatures and their impacts on salmon, such as the protection of undeveloped watersheds and wetlands, need to be prioritized. Yukon Chinook are bilaterally managed under the Yukon River Salmon Agreement, which recognizes that effective conservation and management are of mutual interest. However, harvest remains a primary focus of management, even as allowable catches have declined to zero. Further, the Yukon River Panel has failed to agree on management recommendations in recent years. In the face of unprecedented declines, we need to re-examine this agreement and sharpen the focus on biodiversity conservation and rebuilding. The complexity of the life cycle and management systems for Yukon Chinook necessitate a multi-pronged approach to recovery. Management discussions must shift from border passage to preserving the biodiversity within Canadian origin Yukon Chinook. Canada can lead this discussion by supporting monitoring and assessment of conservation units and improving access to data. There need to be pressure on the U.S. to prioritize effective salmon conservation as outlined in the Yukon Salmon Agreement and reduce any illegal fishing or incidental mortality of Chinook. And although research into drivers of these declines must continue, we cannot wait for evidence to accumulate before taking actions to prevent the extinction of Yukon Chinook. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to our rounds of questioning, and to start off, we'll have Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank all three witnesses for your interesting information today. I want to start off, if I could, please, with Ms. Peacock. Can you tell the committee what type of Chinook salmon inhabit the Yukon River, and actually the Alsek, and what's the other, just a second, the Yukon, Alsek, and Porcupine Rivers? Are these river-type Chinook or ocean-type Chinook? Do they spend time rearing in the river environment, or are they quick migrating out to sea?
They are river-type Chinook. So as I said, because of their long migrations, these fish migrate over 2,000 kilometers upstream. They do spend time in freshwater rearing as juveniles before making it to the ocean. So they're considered 1+ or river-type Chinook. Where they rear is variable, and because of the length of the Yukon River, it's not easy to pinpoint important rearing habitats for these salmon. So they have a lot of area that they can use within the main stem Yukon.
Are there what is often referred to as S0s, S1s, S2s, mixed stocks in those rivers, or are they all basically what I believe there would be called S1s or S2s for river-type fish?
I believe the latter. I don't know of in the lower portions of the Yukon, but for Canadian origin salmon, yeah, it's rearing 1+ majority.
Okay, thank you. And is it known where these stocks migrate to when they hit the open ocean?
There is a fairly good juvenile Chinook sampling program run by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I'm not intimately familiar with the details of that sampling program, but I do know that they have found increased mortality at the juvenile marine stages in recent years as well. So that's certainly being looked at as a contributing factor to these declines.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn now to Ms. Mays, if I could. Ms., have you got
No, there's people speaking.
translation, or is someone talking?
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now.
I can hear you.
What do you see as the biggest risk to the health of the Yukon salmon?
I don't see one biggest risk. I see multiple risks. Of course, we're facing climate change with the warming waters, and the distance and the size of the fish that are coming back are not the same size that they used to be. Therefore, they are not producing the amount of eggs that they would have historically. So we're in the process of needing more fish to get to the spawning grounds. And another one that I do really feel that we need to address is the amount of hatchery fish from pink and chum that are being released into the Bering Sea and the ocean, and the trolleys are a huge component to that. And then, of course, in the Canadian side, we are facing, because we're the longest migration, that they face a barrier of the Whitehorse Rapids Generating Station or hydro plant that has an inefficient ladder, and also facing juvenile mortality on the out migration. So there's just not one, there's multiple. Sorry, I couldn't give you one.
No, thank you. That's very interesting, because you led into what was going to be one of my next questions for some of you, as to what condition these fish are in when they do return to spawn. And you just said they're smaller. Do you believe that's an indication that they have less food available, or is it something that's happened through genetics of the larger fish being harvested through various means and affecting the gene pool?
Yes, there has been some studies on that, and the size of the fish, the large ones back when there was fishing were the ones that were taken in, and they, I'll go back to the traditional knowledge side of it. The indigenous tribes along the Alaska border, they would say, or along the Alaska side of the Yukon River, would say that they knew exactly when they had a Canadian origin fish because of the size of the fish, and that they were oilier and heavier, and they had a fairly larger size, and they were harvested first. So the genetics, of course, is impacted by that, and also just over the years, that's what we're getting through is more of a torpedo-shaped salmon now, and of course that means that we need more of them on the spawning grounds in order to get their numbers back up.
Thank you. Chief Tom, could I ask you to basically answer the same questions? What condition are the fish that you're seeing returning in your area, and why do you think that might be?
Yeah, there are many reports of the fish looking different, as we've heard, smaller. We've heard more scars and softer meat, and just an all-around difference in when we get them to prepare them. You will hear the grandmas, and they'll say like the fish looks different. That like we heard, there are many different factors playing into this. We know that the environment in which they need to survive is suffering somehow, and this is an indication of what is happening. To pinpoint it, we really don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the three of you for being here. And I just also wanted to thank all the committee members who have supported making this study finally happen. And I'm I'm thrilled that we're able to have this discussion on such a critical issue. And I hope over the next few meetings with witnesses, all of us will understand why this is a critical issue. Not just for the Yukon, but for North America, and but also to reflect on the concrete steps that can be taken to address this situation. So, Chief Tom, I'd like to start with you. And in your opening comments, you described yourself as a mother. I know you have a family of which you're very proud. And you have a community right in the middle of the Yukon, the hub of the Yukon, as they say, Carmacks, Yukon, in a very beautiful location. But I wonder if you can describe the impact to your community and to your family of the state of Chinook salmon, including the fish camps and the tradition around the fish camps.
Sure. Our families and our community is what I call in a collective trauma state. It's a heart wound. It's a soul wound. It's affecting everything that we are. We are little salmon Carmacks people. Without salmon, where are we going to go? We've been infiltrated by the gold rush and residential school, and we have a lot of things that have already been taken from us and lost. And at this point, the culture, which is the epitome of our whole nation, is also being lost, and that's the salmon. There are so many things that play into the fish camp, and at this point, our fish camps are left empty, and you can see it all down the Yukon River. This has been happening for very many years, and it's absolutely devastating to our people. Our children at Christmas time, they made a Santa Claus, and they were allowed to, they were asked to ask Santa what they would like, and in that Santa Claus's arms is a huge Chinook salmon. So all of those children are feeling that devastation if they were to write Santa and ask for the salmon to come back. our elders who are used to this, they're used to the vitamin D and all these wonderful omegas that come from it. They're feeling it in their bones. They just want to have the salmon so bad. And everybody is trying to respect that we can't do this right now. And we are taught to leave it alone. It's doli for us. And so it's heartbreaking to see our community and our people in such a devastating loss.
Chief Tom, as a follow-up question, you described that in a kind of a heart-rending way, but how should this be an important issue for Canadians to know about and to reflect upon? Why is this important for Canada, not just your community or the Yukon?
Well, we are all Canadians. We all love our home on Native lands. We are the true North, strong and free. We love hiking and biking and canoeing and skidooing and skating. We love our environment. It's what makes us Canadians. We love the majestic mountains. We love the clear waters. Currently, Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation has an urgent matter in our backyard. We have an old abandoned mine of BYG, and there's a threat that it could be leaking with freshet or busting. There's so many horrible contaminations, deadly contaminations in there that would go into the Dome Creek, into the White River, into the Yukon River. The very ecosystem that is already suffering for the salmon. These issues are huge. It's ecocide. This is the death of environment. The salmon are only giving us an indication and a message for all of our environment that we love as Canadians, and that is why it is important. These things are happening to us right now. We need to listen to the messages.
Thank you so much. I have a little bit of time left, I know, but Brandy, I wonder if you'd be able to describe some of the key activities that Kwalendon First Nation is undertaking in terms of when you're looking at salmon restoration.
Kwalendon has a, thank you. I was going to call you Dr. Hanley, Molly Hanley. Thank you for that question. So Kwalendon has taken on a number of initiatives over the years. For when we look at that, DFO doesn't have part of one of Stephanie's recollection of what DFO has in their files, but Kwalendon has a Michi Creek salmon restoration project, monitoring restoration project we've had for over 24 years that we have been. It's the longest run, one of the longest runs in the world where the salmon go to spawn. And that is one that we've been doing a restoration project. We keep that creek open. We've been moving barriers. We count the reds. We do water temperature quality, water quality. We do a number of initiatives on that one. We've been doing that for a while. We also have the Dakini Sonar Project, which is where we're looking at what the numbers are coming to. The Dakini is a tributary to the Yukon River, which is Dakini is a big salmon river, we call it. Very important to us to look at what kind of numbers are coming back up there so we can look at restoration efforts in that system. Besides all the other formals.
I'll probably have to get you to continue in the next round. But,
okay, yeah, and then the Chinooks, yeah.
And if we don't get time, if I may say, if we don't get time, you could submit in writing any other. Yeah.
We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. With all respect for the issue that we're studying today, I have to take my speaking time in order to discuss my motion, because the urgent character of the situation means I need to take 6 minutes. I wanted to say that the National Assembly of Quebec unanimously voted a motion today in order to show the federal government its concern in terms of the allocations of quota that are too low and the disappearance of the shrimp fishery and the fishers who worked in it in Quebec. This motion was unanimously accepted a few hours ago. So I would like to ask you about the relevance of putting in place 2 studies to see how DFO functions, what criteria it uses in order to determine the life, the survival, and the impact it will have in the villages for all shrimp fishers in Quebec.
At the end, because we've got a couple of motions. But you've got your...
En fait,
5
je
minutes.
pense qu'on pourrait le faire dans mon...
So this is my speaking time. Maybe I can use it in order to do that. I think it could go quickly. So I'm reading the motion. Given the important decrease in the biomass of shrimp, the low allocation of redfish for shrimp fishers, the possible disappearance of the shrimp industry, and the impact on fishers, their helpers, the owners, and the employees of processing plants, and on coastal communities and businesses, given the urgency of acting in accordance with Article 102, the committee undertakes a study on the criteria used to fix the fishing of redfish in order to evaluate the size of the effect of this on the shrimp fishery, that the committee allows 2 meetings to carry out the study, that the 27th of February be used to hear the minister and officials of the department, and that lasts 2 hours. And then on 29th February, we would hear the witnesses that the committee wishes to hear, that the committee communicate its reports and observations to the House.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Chair. And we would have a slight amendment to this motion to propose. I can read it to you. I can send it to the committee if you like. Would you like to have it? Good. I will send it to you, but I'll read it first. At the end of Ms. Debien's motions. Okay, just a second. At the very end, that the committee sent a report of its observations and recommendations to the House. We would replace that by the following: that the committee draft a letter to the minister, that the committee draft a letter at the end of the study with its recommendations to the minister for a plan of help to the shrimp industry.
Just read, it will be that the committee draft a letter at the end of the study with its recommendation to the minister for a plan to assist the shrimp industry. So I'm going to send it to the committee, to the clerk right now.
Any other discussion or
Can,
discussion on the amendment? Yeah.
I think I'm okay. Yeah, can we just have a couple of minutes to suspend?
Yeah, okay, we'll suspend for a couple of minutes.
Très bien. Vous avez tous eu un petit exemplaire de l'amendement de M. Cormier. Matière à discussion? S'il n'y en a pas, nous allons voter sur l'amendement. Ou est-ce que c'est adopté à l'unanimité?
Position to the amendment.
Okay.
Il n'y a pas d'opposition à l'amendement. Très bien. Madame Desbiens, donc l'amendement vous convient?
Ms. Barron?
Compte tenu de l'urgence de la situation,
Given the urgency of the situation, for me, the letter would be maybe more effective to.
Très bien. Nous passons maintenant à Monsieur le Président. Un éclaircissement, s'il vous plaît. Je veux m'adresser, je veux m'assurer que la greffière avait bien compris. Oui? Très bien. Monsieur Arnold? Merci. Il semble y avoir une pléthore de nouvelles motions, d'études qui s'additionnent. Il y en a une qui est déposée, qui déplace les autres. Et, rappel au règlement.
The translation is
No,
working.
no translation?
Yeah.
I can try
Okay.
again to see if
Try
the
again.
translation is there.
Try again, Mel.
Okay. We seem to be having a lot of study motions coming in. One replaces or displaces motions and studies that we already have on the docket. And the next time around, we have another study motion, another study to displace what we've agreed to in the last meeting. I suggest, Mr. Chair, we should probably have a subcommittee meeting to discuss some of this to try and determine the workflow and work plan in the near future. But with that, I'll turn it over to others.
Actually, I agree to a certain extent, Mr. Arnold, that we should pretty soon have a hour or so dedicated to committee business to look at what's already in the bucket to be done and new ones that have come in to see where and when things are going to fit. I mean, between now and June, there's really not a lot. I mean, March got 1 week, one sitting week in March. So, and then it's April, May, June, you're done. So we should try and do that no later than, if it's not Thursday of this week, we should try and do it when we first come back from the break week to try and nail this down. So again, I'll go back to the motion as amended. Everybody okay with it? And, you know, I know it was asked for February 27th and February 29th, but that may not happen, but we will have a hour or so dedicated to just committee business when we come back after next week's break and look at the schedule and see where we can fit things in. And because we've got witnesses lined up for Thursday already for the Yukon study, salmon study. So I don't want to cancel on them right now because they're making arrangements. Yes, Mr. Arnold.
If I could, we also still have to provide drafting instructions for the IUU study, and hopefully we can do that before all of our memories fade over what we've heard. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so on the motion as amended. Everybody okay with it? Okay, thumbs up for everybody. All right. Now, back to
Ms. Barron. Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Lots of really great testimony that'll help us in our work on this important topic. Mr. Chair, this should only take 1 minute at most because it pertains to the study, which is why I'm bringing it up now. I did provide a motion to my colleagues. I believe the clerk has it to circulate as well. But pertaining to the study that we're talking about today, I just wanted to move that the committee include, the word include is in there, 2 hours of witness testimony to its study on the population sustainability of Yukon salmon stocks focused on transboundary issues related to the long-term health of BC wild salmon populations. It's become increasingly evident as we're listening to witnesses that this motion is important to expand the study slightly. However, it won't take more time. It will be included within the study at hand.
Thank you. We've heard the terms of the motion. Mr. Arnold?
Yeah, just to add clarity, the paper document that was circulated had the word "add 2 hours."
No,
The motion,
she actually changed it to include on the
Okay.
one I got.
okay, and we had agreed to that,
Okay.
the wording changed. Thank you.
All right, everybody okay with the motion as presented? Okay, done. All right.
Great. So I can move on with my lines of questions?
Yes.
Good.
Thank you. You still have 4.5 minutes.
Whew. All right. So lots of great testimony provided today. My first question, I believe it's Dr. Peacock, is it not? I want to make sure I'm getting this right. Dr. Peacock, you had spoken about the public data, the lack of public data being available since 2008. Can you tell us a little bit more about the lack of data and the implications of the lack of data and any further information you'd like to provide?
Sure, and it's a great opportunity to elaborate on that because I'd like to point out that, as Brandy said, there is a lot of monitoring that's happening, and First Nations have taken amazing leadership on monitoring salmon within their territories. I think one of the issues is that there hasn't been leadership by DFO in centralizing and making available data. So even though there is also DFO-led monitoring, a number of sonar projects, those data are largely made public through the Joint Technical Committee meetings and the Yukon River Panel meetings, but they're really buried in hundreds of pages of PDF reports that you cannot easily, extract numbers from. They're not provided in an analyzable format. And so for the work that I do, trying to understand salmon populations, share that information publicly, create a common baseline understanding of how salmon are doing, it's extremely challenging to dig these data out of reports, copy them hand by hand, line by line. I can't even copy and paste out of the Joint Technical Committee reports because they are password protected. So I think accessibility is a major issue here, and DFO has historically been charged with compiling, analyzing and making accessible data. Increasingly, we're seeing that data collection happen by First Nations, and kudos to them. But it does mean that there's a bit of a gap in that larger picture understanding. And so that's what I really see as a role that needs to be filled.
Thank you so much, and hopefully I won't put you in a position, Ms. Mays, where you're cut off again at the end. But I wanted to see if you could expand a little bit about, you talked about the importance of Indigenous knowledge going hand in hand with science. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit, because I think it relates to what we were just talking about.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So Indigenous knowledge, when we look at both knowledge systems, that they're equally important, and we tend to put Indigenous knowledge aside and recognize most of the science. When you actually look at what's happening on the Yukon River, if you look at what the people are actually who live along the river are the actual people that know what's happening. They've maintained these salmon populations and had a relationship with salmon for thousands of years. And they've not depleted. And now we look at that we've been managing this by science, and we're in trouble. It's been by numbers only and quantitative, and it's not looking at what is happening in the river. And we look at what the pilot station says, and it says it's science. It's like the numbers are coming through. Okay, we're going to manage to the upper level of how many salmon we can take out of that system. When the actual Indigenous people are saying, no, we have to slow down. Even though our people have been saying for 20 years, we need to slow down in fishing. We need to recognize that we need to, not take all the first run because that's our first one that's going to get through. The fast ones are the males, and then everybody's like, okay, well, it's the middle of the run, we're going to take the next one. Well, we know that that's the bigger salmon as a people on the river, that's the slower females that are coming through. That's where we know that we need to get those females through, and that was why we didn't take that big pulse in the second one. We take the first ones because we knew there were still more males coming. These were just traditional knowledge, when that is the actual knowledge of seeing what's happening on the river. Why it's so important to take that into consideration when we're looking at developing a rebuilding plan, or even when you're managing in season, they call it. Yes. I hope I got that out fast enough.
20 seconds.
Oh, that's okay.
You're gonna
I'm
give
not
that
going to
back.
put any of our witnesses in the position to try to answer something in 15 seconds now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have 5 more minutes left in our opening hour. I believe Mr. Bragdon is next. If he could go under 5, it'd be great.
No hint there, Mr. Chair. That's all right.
No.
Good to be with you, and I want to thank each of the witnesses today. Thank you for taking the time. We're honored to have you join us, and thanks to our colleague, Mr. Hanley, for pushing to make sure this happened and his passion around this issue. So it's so important and so vital, and I hope to someday have the opportunity of visiting the beautiful Yukon Territory. I've never been to the Yukon, so at some point, hopefully that will happen. But hearing your stories and hearing, obviously, the significance and the connection between the salmon and your peoples is powerful indeed. And I'm kind of a practical type of person, and I know I'm not as technical or as scientific, but just stepping back and looking at it through a layman's lens and cutting right through all of the data and the information, which is all very important. If I could bring it down to where do you rank, let's say, the top 3 biggest challenges, and I know there's numerous challenges, but the top 3 biggest challenges to which you feel that we could get to a solution to fastest, or have action taken fastest, practical steps taken that could get us closer to seeing a rehabilitation of the stocks in your rivers? And I know it's kind of a big, broad question, open, but I think a lot of people listening today want to know, okay, well, what is the things we do? Overall temperatures and overall things like that, they're big challenges that are going to be with us for a long time. I don't know if there's anything immediate that is going to fix or solve that problem, especially by one nation. But there are things within our control locally, perhaps, that we can do. So I'll start with you, Ms. Mays, and then I'd be interested to hear from Dr. Peacock and, of course, from Chief Tom. So that's my long preamble, but now it's over to you to kind of answer the big questions.
Well, there's not one, but thank you, and we will welcome you to the Yukon if you come and visit us for sure, and we'll show you a good time. Anyway, I would like to say that our number one for Kwanlin Dun is that we are looking at the agreements underneath their Chapter 16 that we need a fishway, a new fishway. That is one. It's not immediate. It's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of resources and money. But that is one that we need in migration and out migration to be done. We need to look at what's happening to the impacts from that dam, continue those studies. There is some work being done there. That's number one for us, for Kwanlin Dun. We also need to look at the Stewardship Center is like looking at, we can do a small restoration stewardship or conservation hatchery that we can look at to taking some of the what's left or their brood stock to make sure that we can restore some of these creeks. Number 3 for us would be that's just really, I can't really get and put me on the spot, but I think the rebuilding strategies from support for that and working with the U.S. on the ocean bycatch, that's the number one thing that I think is for us on the other side.
Thank you. And that was a big question, so I'll just get quickly with my time here. Over to you, Dr. Peacock, and then I definitely want to hear from Chief Tom. So try and keep it as succinct as we can. Top 3.
I don't have much to add over Brandy. She did an amazing job. I think with the Whitehorse Dam, the key is, although that will take time, the opportunity is immediate, right? As she said, the license is being renegotiated now for 2025. So that's an immediate opportunity. And again, as she said, putting pressure on our partners across the border in the U.S. To limit illegal and incidental mortality of Chinook. Those are immediate changes. Other things are going to be hard and take time, but we also need to start on those sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And Chief Tom.
Merci Cho for your question, and yes, come visit the Yukon. You will enjoy yourself. I would say the 3 would be the agreement that we have with Alaska that needs to be negotiated. I would say regulating the mine contaminated water discharge into the tributary spawning areas in the Yukon River. And I would also say the 3rd would be the dam.
Okay. That's excellent. Is that
30 seconds.
30 seconds. I'll do the same thing. I'll be very kind. I don't want to cut them off. Thank you. You all did great. Thank you. That's helpful.
All right, well, that concludes our first hour of testimony with our witnesses. I want to say thank you to Brandy Mays and Dr. Peacock and Chief Nicole Tom for attending today in person and by Zoom, and for sharing your knowledge with the committee on this very important study. And if there's anything you think of that you would like to include in any of the answers or questions that you were asked, please, by all means, send it in to the clerk, and we'll make sure it becomes a part of the discussion. So again, we're going to take a short recess or suspension while we change out. Everybody is on Zoom for the next hour or so. So again, suspend
Thanks,
it for a
everybody.
moment.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses that just joined us. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, which all the witnesses for this session are. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English or French. For those in the room, which we only have ourselves, I think, there's no witnesses in the room, so I won't read that. Also, I simply want to remind members to be very careful when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbour's microphone is turned on. Earpiece is placed too close to a microphone are one of the most common causes of sound feedback, which is extremely harmful to interpreters and causes serious injury. Welcome to our witnesses. We have today on our second panel by Zoom, as an individual, we have, and I apologise if I make a mess of this name, Bathsheba Demuth, Dean's Associate Professor of History and Environment and Society at Brown University. We also have Mr. Dennis Zimmerman, Fish and Wildlife Consultant, Pacific Salmon Treaty Panel member, Big Fish, Little Fish Consultants. And from Beaver Village Council, we have Chief Rhonda Pitka. And from the Council of Yukon First Nations, we have Elizabeth MacDonald. We will begin our first round of questions. Thank you. No, we won't. Opening statements we'll do first. So we'll go with Bethesda Demuth. As 5 minutes or less, please, for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good job with the name. It is Bathsheba. You got it right. It's an honor to speak with you today. I'd like to start my brief remarks just by framing who I am. I'm an environmental historian currently writing a book about the relationship between people and ecology along the Yukon watershed over the past 2 centuries. So salmon clearly has a lot to do with this story and the ways that salmon stocks have been managed. And as part of this work, I've been traveling the river, particularly up to this point on the Alaska side by boat and by dog team, as well as working with archival sources and scientific research. What is clear from this at a very general, but I think critical point, is that salmon are an integral part of Alaska Native and First Nations communities' lives, as well as for other subsistence users along the Yukon River and its tributaries. And this has been true as far back as there have been people along this river. Today, fish camps are places of cultural sharing and language learning and social revitalization. And so being able to fish is an issue of food security and of environmental justice. And I know that members of this committee are traveling to Yukon to speak with First Nations and people more on the ground. So I will focus briefly on 3 points that have emerged from my interviews and general research around settlement, mineral extraction, and the regulatory challenge that climate change poses to the Yukon River Treaty. First, as to settlement, I'm going to generalize here substantially because the Yukon is very long, but a key historical adaptation to living in the Yukon's Arctic and subarctic ecologies has been for societies to move, to be fully or partly nomadic, so that when, say, a caribou migration pattern changes, people can adjust where they lived and hunted to be able to intersect with both caribou and with salmon. Since the active colonization by the United States and Canada, particularly through compulsory education, First Nation and Alaska Native peoples have become far less mobile because you can't move a village like Old Crow just because the caribou are in a different place. But you can build communities near good salmon fishing. So the colonial expectation of permanence has made salmon a particularly critical resource for Indigenous communities, both culturally and economically. And I wish to underscore the critical need for salmon in communities along the Yukon that are at the end of the global supply chain, so that food is expensive and sometimes simply unreliable. So this makes salmon a critical food security issue. Secondly, the history of mineral extraction and salmon. In some ways, this is a familiar history that starts with the Yukon Gold Rush near the Klondike River that intersects with salmon and their needs for spawning streams, and continues through the Faro Mine and other large-scale mineral projects. But residents along the river emphasized to me over the last several years how concerned they are that this history is not over due to potential land withdrawals by the Bureau of Land Management in the United States on the D1 lands, which would be familiar to Alaskans, as well as the Manh Choh Mine and the proposed Ambler Road, all of which impact Yukon River tributaries. Historically, the wealth that is generated from mining projects does not stay in local communities, while the harms do. So all along the river, I've heard concern that this history of environmental injustice is likely to repeat. in part because the discussion of salmon futures is so often separated from mining and economic development writ large. And third and finally, the Yukon Salmon Treaty and the Yukon River Panel, as my fellow panelists here all know, is charged with setting annual goals to ensure that enough spawning salmon are able to meet the minimum sustainable escapement numbers by regulating the quantity of fishing that happens in the Yukon River. And when the treaty was signed in 2001, I believe that this was a sensible move based on the history of commercial and subsistence fishing for Yukon salmon, both of which primarily occurred in river. But of course, Yukon salmon spend most of their lives not in the Yukon, but in the Bering Sea, which is an ecosystem that is experiencing such a rapid degree of change, basically out of superlatives, as the climate warms, and where there are additional ecological pressures from the pollock fishery, which removes some 3 billion pounds of biomass from the Bering Sea basin every year. And every person I have spoken to on the Yukon River Panel is deeply dedicated to having generations of salmon. But in this contemporary environment, they do not necessarily have the levers to pull to address either bycatch or the changing climate. Essentially, the Yukon River Salmon Agreement lays out 20th century tools for what are becoming very 21st century problems: climate change and ecosystem change driven to intensive harvesting. I want to leave my remarks here by noting that people do have tens of thousands of years of experience living well with salmon. And in fact, this is the historical experience, the normal historical experience for salmon and people. So it is a thing that can be done. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Mr. Zimmerman for 5 minutes or less, please, for your opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to address this esteemed committee today. My name is Dennis Zimmerman, and I reside at Whitehorse, Yukon, on the traditional territories of the Kwalndun First Nation and the Ta'an-Quachang Council. The various hats I wear related to salmon are as a member of the land claim established Yukon Salmon Subcommittee. I also sit as a Canadian representative on 2 international salmon treaty tables, the Yukon River Panel, Chapter 8, and the Transboundary Panel, Chapter 1 of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. I'm a respective Government of Canada and recreational fishery nominee through those 2 processes. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the significance of this specific inquiry and the unique importance of the Yukon River Chinook salmon. Briefly, Yukon River Chinook were historically large, old, and prominent in that returning adults would often travel in river and over 3,000 kilometers to their spawning grounds in Canada. I've often talked to Alaskans that catch both Canadian origin and U.S. origin Chinook, and they speak of the Canadian king salmon with puddles of fat on the ground when they put them up in their smokehouse. So this nutritional value is highly prized in communities that have severe food security concerns. I should also identify that the lens through which I work with salmon, and I often find I'm in the minority, my work has always been centered around community values, human dimensions, and the intricate socio-ecological systems that surround these cherished species. I also work within the philosophy that if people, First Nations, recreational fishers, general public are not interacting with salmon in some way, they are not likely to care nor wish to support it. Having worked with various First Nations, Yukon First Nations, on a number of community-based salmon plans, I've witnessed firsthand the profound impacts that the decline of salmon populations have had on cultures, peoples, and ecosystems throughout the territory. As we know, the life history of Pacific salmon is faced with multiple stressors at all life stages, many of which has recently been exacerbated by the effects of climate change. Very briefly, delving into the causality of this crisis, one needs to reflect on past fisheries practices, where it's evident that the maximum sustainable yield approaches, coupled with uncertainties in run size projections and a reluctance to manage in-season fisheries, took their toll on Chinook salmon populations and essentially beat down their resilience over the years. Over decades, we've witnessed the loss of older year classes and larger, more fecund fish, ultimately resulting in a shift towards fewer, younger, and smaller salmon returning. We call this quality of escapement, which is not generally accepted within the treaty as a metric to meet escapement goals. In my opinion, there was not enough risk and precautionary principle built into the management regimes, whereby treaty escapement goals were considered to be met by achieving the bottom end of ranges and putting just enough Canadian origin fish into the spawning grounds. Despite a proliferation of science, often thrown at Yukon River Chinook, what we often refer to as the counting and measuring approach, the status quo has failed to effectively address the decline in salmon populations. Approximately 2 decades ago, Yukon First Nation voices began sounding the alarm, particularly at the headwaters in Canada, with the Tesin Tlingit Council, where at every meeting, elders like Madeline Jackson would advocate for voluntary subsistence fishery closures in Canada and across the river. These community voices continued to sound and have moved consistently downriver to the point at where we are at now, where the impacts are being felt from the headwaters to the ocean. All 50-plus communities that depend in some way on Yukon River Chinook in Alaska and Yukon are suffering, no longer fishing, and most importantly, losing their connection to salmon culture. Unfortunately, this is another fishery that has shown us that management decisions often lag behind the pace of the resource decline. It is with heavy heart that we must acknowledge that there may be no fisheries into the foreseeable future. Despite the bleak outlook, we can't lose hope, and we need to continue fighting for Yukon River salmon. Now is the time to ensure that science does not go alone, and we employ all the tools in the toolbox. This means, in my opinion, enhanced investments in community-based stewardship efforts, maximizing the value of the few fish that are returning through ceremony, language, story, knowledge transfer, through small-scale restoration efforts. This may include a variety of habitat restoration efforts or Indigenous-led conservation hatcheries, as an example, and as well maintain the advocacy and diplomatic efforts within the United States and the international community, continuing to advocate for Canadian origin Chinook returns to spawning grounds, as well as coordinate efforts in the high seas as it relates to bycatch, unregulated international fisheries, and production hatcheries in the Bering Sea. Finally, I'm hopeful that with the continued support of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Yukon First Nations, and other partners, our current efforts towards a holistic Yukon River Chinook rebuilding plan will provide the blueprint and momentum to help conserve and rebuild our populations so that future generations may maintain that sacred connection to salmon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We'll now go to Chief Rhonda Pitka for 5 minutes or less, please.
Hi, thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee to assist in building greater understanding of the crisis involving Yukon River Chinook salmon and the impacts the crisis has had on the Indigenous peoples of Alaska, as well as Canada. I am Chief Rhonda Pitka of Beaver, Alaska. Beaver is a small fly-in only community on the Yukon River, just south of the Arctic Circle, and the first community downriver of all the confluences of the Porcupine River in the Yukon. I am chairwoman of the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments, a consortium that serves 9 tribes in the Yukon Flats of Alaska. I am also a public member of the Federal Subsistence Board and a member of the Yukon River Panel. Our people have historically relied on Chinook salmon and chum as our main food sources and a central part of our culture and way of life. Our people are salmon people. Our health and the health of the salmon are inextricably linked. What befalls the salmon befalls our people. Over the last 20 years, we have seen stocks of Yukon River Chinook and chum salmon be obliterated by numerous challenges, all of human origin, all originating from outside our small communities along the Yukon River. As the stocks of salmon have dwindled, our food security has become imperiled. Our smokehouses that used to be filled with a winter supply of salmon sit empty, and our children's critical link to our food, culture, and way of life has been severed. We have not had salmon for funeral potlatches for our people. This crucial religious and cultural ceremony need has not been met for the last 4 years of no harvest. There aren't enough salmon to feed my community or the communities along the upper Yukon River in Alaska that I represent, or our relatives in Canada along the Yukon and Porcupine Rivers. That much is clear. We have not fished for the last 4 years. We have not had a subsistence harvest that has met our needs. We've been told that our subsistence harvest is the reason we have not had returns of salmon. It is simply not true. Subsistence accounts for less than 1% of the total take of statewide harvesting of fish and other resources. The subsistence fishers of Alaska have given their traditional knowledge generously to the state of Alaska and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Without the traditional knowledge, it becomes difficult for managers to have a clear idea if their models of the run are correct. The managers use the number of salmon coming in at Pilot Station to estimate the run size and abundance of Canadian origin Chinook salmon. There is currently no mid-river sonar to ground truth the estimate. The subsistence harvest helps management by giving in-season information of the timing of the run and the size of the run, and if the estimates at the mouth of the Yukon River are correct or accurate. The accuracy of the run size and timing is dependent on the knowledge of those fishermen along the Yukon River. The Chinook salmon fishery disaster hinders the customary and traditional selling, bartering, and trading economy of the fishery. This is absolutely the case along the Yukon River, where depleted salmon runs have prevented our people from fishing and from participating in traditional economic practices of selling, bartering, and trading Yukon River salmon. We used to have extensive traditional bartering networks and community relations that have been strained because we have not had enough salmon to trade. The backbone of our livelihood is the traditional salmon fishery. The subsistence fishery is the primary economy in our region. Where I'm from, in the village of Beaver, we do not have grocery stores. We don't have access to regular fresh food that people have. So we have to fly in food if we don't have it on the ground. Furthermore, totally unaddressed through existing federal processes is the loss of tribal food sovereignty and food security, the ability to teach our children and transmit Indigenous knowledge related to salmon stewardship, including providing for healthy salmon and salmon populations, processing, preparation, and storing. Entire social networks, health, and well-being have been devastated. Our children have never handled salmon. Our fishermen slump into depression. Domestic violence incidents, suicide increase along with the increases in substance abuse because our people are not fishing. The loss of the Yukon River salmon and the cultural activities and spiritual values associated with salmon fishing are devastating our communities and villages. Our tribes are not sitting idle. While the state and federal government have continued conducting studies on the impacts of climate change, debating the impacts of bycatch and intercept fisheries, and subsidizing commercial fisheries, here's what our tribes have been doing. We have not fished. We implemented a self-imposed moratorium in 2014 in order to allow salmon to make the spawning grounds. This resulted in meeting the border passage goals into Canada in 2014. We have left our fish camps empty. Many of our children have not fished in their lifetime. We were told to buy 7.5-inch nets as one of the management ways to change the number of salmon that we were getting. So we did that. We changed our net sizes to 6-inch nets. When that didn't work, we bought 4-inch nets for our people. We've educated ourselves on ocean fishery science. As a fisherwoman along the Yukon River, the ocean is not where I'm from, but I've had to educate myself on things that are way outside of my purview. We have spent thousands of hours and dollars on advocacy and legal action around the fisheries in our region.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it there, Chief Pitka, because it's gone way over the 5 minutes. Hopefully anything you didn't get to say will come out in the line of questioning. I'll go to Elizabeth MacDonald now for 5 minutes or less, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to participate today in the study. So my name is Elizabeth MacDonald, and I'm the Manager of Fisheries at the Council of Yukon First Nations. In this position, I support the work of Yukon First Nation Salmon Stewardship Alliance, which is our local AROM. I'm also one of the vice chairs of the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee, which is an advisory body created under the umbrella of Final Agreement. And for that role, I was nominated by Vuntut Gwitchin government as a Porcupine River salmon representative. I'm going to focus on the Yukon River salmon because LSAC salmon are doing relatively better. I did provide additional information and briefing note as well. So Chinook are the most significant salmon in the main stem of the Yukon River as both a food species and a culturally significant salmon. They are highly dispersed with over 100 documented spawning locations. They are unique as no other salmon migrates as far, with the furthest migration being 3,200 kilometers. This is part of why they are so important, as they provide many people and habitats with food and nutrients. Unfortunately, the salmon has been experiencing widespread declines and changes for some time. Traditional knowledge in the community say this decline started before Western science in the 80s. Chum are also present in higher numbers, but they are not as widespread as Chinook. In recent times, chum have experienced highs and lows. Chum are the most important and numerous species on the Porcupine River, a tributary to the Yukon River. Unfortunately, they are experiencing a long-term depressed population. In the last 23 years since the Yukon River Salmon Agreement has been in place, the spawning goal has only been met 9 times. Very little information is available on Chinook and Coho in this river. Then in 2020, we had a salmon crash. All salmon numbers plummeted. Chinook are about 12% of the average at the mouth of the river in the last 2 years, and up to 40% of them are dying between the mouth of the river and the border. Chum and the main stem have the lowest 4 out of 5 spawning estimates since 1980, and about 20% of the average spawning escapement estimate. Porcupine chum in 2020, 2021, and 2022 are the lowest estimates on record since 1971 at Fishing Branch Weir. This is about 5.5% of the average spawning estimate. Last year was slightly better, and I think this was due to better environmental conditions during the migration. Porcupine River Coho for the last 2 years are the lowest on record. The situation is dire for all the salmon species on the Yukon River. We are legitimately concerned about the extinction of them. I am sure that we have already lost smaller populations of Chinook. Unfortunately, the solution isn't as easy as stopping fishing. Even if all human harvest was zero, salmon numbers would not rebound. Climate change is having a larger impact. Since the crash, our river has been hot enough to kill salmon. We have sustained and frequent flooding, and we have seen low water, much more variable than normal, which has affected migrating salmon and rearing juveniles during the freshwater stages. The Bering Sea is also warmer than ever. This has impacted the food webs, and salmons are switching prey. This has decreased the energy available to them and decreased some important nutrients. It has also resulted in a large increase in the ick disease, which is likely responsible for a significant amount of the Chinook dying during their migration. We need climate action, and we need to support Alaskans with habitat improvement in the Bering Sea. We also need to watch our own habitat and ensure development and other impacts don't harm salmon. We need to increase our capacity. We have dedicated and passionate and absolutely wonderful individuals working diligently to improve things for salmon, fishers, and the ecosystems on both sides of the border. The amount of passion and knowledge that we collectively share is incredible, and we truly accomplish so much, but there simply aren't enough of us to do all the work. This is particularly true with my First Nation colleagues, as most Yukon First Nation governments don't even have a dedicated salmon person. Instead, staff cover off many species. Each First Nation needs their own dedicated salmon staff so they can focus on restoration work and keeping salmon culture alive until someone recovers. We also need accessible funding so we can do restoration work. Funding needs to be secure and long-term so we can focus on rebuilding salmon populations and not administrating funding agreements. If we lose salmon, we'll be losing more than just food and culture. We'll be losing a key ecosystem species. Marine-derived nutrients are extremely rare, 3,200 kilometers from the ocean. If we lose these, our freshwater terrestrial animals and habitats will also suffer. Finally, I want to stress how Alaskan communities depend upon salmon for food. While this is also true on our side of the border, it is the larger issue in Alaska. In Alaska, some people need to choose between illegally fishing or starving. We need to support Alaskans so they have better options and in turn can support salmon recovery. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You give me back 30 seconds, so that's a great help. I will now go to Mr. Arnold now for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for your input. It's valued that we try and rebuild our Pacific salmon stocks. I want to start just by doing a round to each of you. I want to ask the same questions. What are the 2 biggest threats to these Pacific salmon, and what do you see as the key levers that can be pulled, or what are the key tools that can be used to remove or mitigate those threats? So, Ms. Demuth, if I could start with you, I'm just going to go through the list as we had it on our notice of meeting. What are the two biggest threats, and what levers or tools could be used to mitigate those threats?
Thank you for this question. I think the two biggest threats, and this came up in pretty much everyone's testimony here today, is one of them is climate change and what it's doing both in river and to the Bering Sea. I think secondarily are the kind of increased ecosystem pressures in the Bering Sea that are not directly related to climate change and have to do with large-scale fishing, which hurts salmon as bycatch, but also is changing the food webs in the Bering Sea in other ways. And in terms of tools, I think that one tool that has been effective in other situations in the United States where species are in both endangered but critical for subsistence is to have a much clearer way of co-managing the salmon stocks between First Nations and Alaska Native communities and the federal and state governments to set priorities that would be more in line with what Chief Pitka and Dennis Zimmerman both outlined, thinking about salmon as not just numbers, but in terms of the health of the fish and how they're being used along the river. And I think secondly,
stop you there in order to get through all four and the further questions I've got. Mr. Zimmerman, you would be next on my list.
Thank you. As you'll know, I'll predict that a lot of us will have similar thoughts. I'll focus on two quickly. I think Elizabeth McDonald mentioned the physiological stress on rising water temperature, which is resulting in a lot of pre-spawn mortality. Fish just aren't making it where they used to go. That's a big threat. What can we do? The levers we have to pull, you've heard to me, it's about all the tools in the toolbox. I think unfortunately, fishery closures are one of the things we can manage, and we are doing that. So, that that's already been put on. I think, secondly, losing connection to salmon culture is a threat for Pacific salmon, because if people are not connected to them, First Nations and the general public, we're not going to care and we won't advocate for them, and there'll be a shifting baseline.
Thank you. And was it Chief Pitka? Yes, Chief Pitka, if you could go ahead.
Yes, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. So the two biggest threats, as I see, are also climate change and the trawl fisheries. Shutting down the trawl fisheries and the hatcheries would decrease some of the threats. So the salmon are coming back smaller and weaker, but it's also because of ocean conditions. And one of those ocean conditions is the trawl fishery and what they're doing to the herring. So it's causing malnutrition in the salmon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McDonald.
Yeah, thank you. I would say climate change again being a big one, and then kind of like Dennis suggested was people losing connection with salmon is also a major threat. If people aren't connected, they won't go out and fight for protections for habitat and give up other things to keep the habitat. For tools, we definitely have the Yukon River Panel and the Joint Technical Committee as a way to have coordination across the border and work together. So I think that's a key tool that we can use and continue to use. I also think we need to get food out to people so people aren't in such a bad situation where they have to choose between feeding family or not eating, right? So I think that's a big tool we could help with and is within our realm of control for quick. Otherwise, yeah, restoration is something we need to look at, like Ms. Mays talked about earlier with the Stewardship Center, Restoration Stewardship Center. It would be a fantastic thing to have in all the communities.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn back now to Mr. Zimmerman. I believe you said that the condition of the fish is not considered in the treaty or the process. Can you elaborate a little bit further on that? Is it just numbers that are used, or is it biomass? How is that discussed and negotiated?
It's purely numbers. It's number, and in fact, they use the word pieces quite often. It's a number of pieces of salmon. So, yeah, that's the essential metric. We started seeing size declines at the headwaters in particular. Large fish were disappearing. That, of course, is a productivity issue. Less fecund fish, they have fewer eggs. Rhonda Pitka mentioned around the changing net size. So we were doing that in relation to trying to preserve and protect the larger Chinook. And it should be noted that these Chinook are we're up to 8 years old. We lost the 8-year-olds. We're pretty much lost the 7-year-olds, and now we're down to 4 to 6-year-olds. So that's a huge canary in the coal mine problem.
Okay, thank you. So basically, as long as the proposed number of fish are getting through, nothing changes in the ratios or the catch or retention downstream.
That's correct. We are reporting on size and sex ratios and various other things now in age class. We've always reported on age class, but yes, the actual metric for the treaty is number of fish.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Yeah, thank you all for appearing and for the really interesting and important testimony. I think I'd like to begin with Chief Pitka. Very moving testimony. Thank you very much. You mentioned that subsistence accounts for less than 1% of total take. I'm assuming the other 99% would be largely related to the trawl fishery. Could you explain a little bit about that and elaborate?
Okay, so 99% of the take in the state of Alaska is actually it's 98.2% of the state total take is the commercial fisheries harvest. There is 1%. About 1% that is for sport harvesters, and then the other 1% is the subsistence harvesters, who primarily use this to feed our families and, keep our culture alive. Thank you.
And when you say commercial fishery, can you just elaborate, like what is actually what's it within that commercial fishery, including what's bycatch and what's deliberate catch?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily an expert on the commercial fishery in the state of Alaska, but it is primarily the pink salmon harvest in the Gulf of Alaska, and then also the Area M fishery that is catching most of the salmon, and that's where the bycatch is happening for the Yukon River Chinook salmon.
Thank you. And lastly, I think you mentioned, you did mention in response to Mr. Arnold's questions the importance of reducing, or I'm not sure if you said shutting down or reducing the trawl fishery. Like how could you even begin to do that? Like what would be the steps towards doing that? And is there a federal as well as a state role in addressing that?
Yeah, shutting down the trawl fishery is entirely within the purview of the Secretary of the Interior and the Department of Commerce for the United States federal government. But it's also within the purview of the state of Alaska. They can severely limit the number of commercial fishing licenses that they have. And those numbers account for much higher numbers than the subsistence harvest has ever had. And cutting down that commercial fishing harvest and opportunity has had greater effects on the numbers of Yukon River salmon coming back into the river. We can see that in the 1990s when they shut down commercial fishing around Area M because Bristol Bay was not getting enough fish back into their rivers and their lakes. So we've seen the effects that that's had, and it's been fairly effective. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Zimmerman, Dennis, we've had many conversations, of course. We've traveled together to Washington, D.C., along with Chief Tom who was on the previous panel, and Senator Duncan. But one of the things that I remember that struck me the most from our conversations was you said that what's happening in the Yukon River is it's like a harbinger for the entire West Coast salmon. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a little bit.
No, thank you, NP Hanley. I appreciate the question. Absolutely. One of the things we realize, and I happen to be in Vancouver right now at Pacific Salmon Treaty negotiations for another chapter. So I have the unique advantage of being able to see these various panels and fisheries along the West Coast. The Yukon is unique. It's a northern species. They're uniquely adapted to the north. We're seeing declines across the entire West Coast. These are large, prolific Chinook that obviously are special to everyone. Everyone's salmon are special. I think that what if we have an opportunity with these fish, if we can actually conserve, rebuild these fish, I think we have an opportunity to be a template for what will essentially happen. There's multiple active commercial interests along the west coast for Pacific salmon. You know, we're largely talking about subsistence fishers that are united in this front. There are similar international interests. There could be cohesion in that regard. So I guess from my perspective, I think it's worth, we have an opportunity to essentially support these northern species, which I think can trickle down and provide that impetus for saving all the stocks along the Pacific coast. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. Elizabeth, over to you. There's, given your position with Council of Yukon First Nations, I know you're very familiar with governance, and we don't have time to go over sort of the intricacies of governance, but maybe you could talk about the importance of understanding between the levels of government and how important it is that we understand that relationship, especially considering the umbrella final agreement.
Yeah, and I know Tim will speak more on the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee and the management that plays at a later date, but it's really important the governments work together and we have a good relationship. So that's Yukon First Nation governments, Yukon Territorial Government, and then the federal government as well, particularly around the work with the Yukon River Panel. We need to all be saying the same things and moving towards the same goal. And I feel like we're doing that currently, and we're making great headway. I feel like even just a year ago, we weren't all moving in the same direction, and you can see what a difference it has made for the salmon on the salmon front. So it's really key, and having First Nation advisors at the Yukon River Panel and having those direct connections has been absolutely fantastic, and it really does allow people along the river to have an input on those processes, which means people buy into them more, which is exactly what we need.
Thank you, Mr. Henley. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have one or two questions, and I'll share my time with Mr. Henley, given that it's a subject that is of great interest to him, and this is all quite far from Quebec. But we also have salmon in Quebec and other issues that can be related sometime. So I will ask Mr. Zimmerman this question. You have talked about bycatch, and I also heard someone else talk about pollock fishery, which has billions of tons of bycatch or effect on the biomass in terms of billions of tons. Is this still something that is happening? It's a serious. Is it still has such a huge effect on the entire biomass, as the witnesses said today?
I will also admit that I'm not an expert on this particular area, but I do know that it is, over the years, it was a significant issue for Yukon River Chinook. The practices improved. There were observers. There's various things they did to ensure that those catches were minimized. My understanding is they have crept up again. So this is something we're always trying to work on and make sure we advocate for. I think there are some significant high seas issues that Alaska and Yukon, Canada and U.S. can align together on. This area M fishery, which is something that Rhonda Fitka brought forward, Chief Fitka. So again, it is one of those things we have control over. It is a very much salt in the wound in that there are still some of these high seas commercial fisheries taking place while all subsistence fishers on the Yukon River in Alaska, Yukon are. So in principle, that in itself is probably the deepest wound that we're dealing with, and frankly, it's quite offensive to everyone on the in-river who's not able to fish.
C'est un peu ce qu'on constate de l'autre côté.
That's what we're also seeing on the eastern coast. Mr. Manley, I give you my time. Thank you very much.
Well, this is great. So I didn't get to ask Ms. Demuth any questions, Professor Demuth, and I'd like you have a history that goes back to your to your residents in Old Crow in Yukon, I believe, and so you're very familiar with the Yukon. But you're also a researcher, and in what I understand, you have experience in research in the biological and hydrological life of the Yukon River watershed. And so I wonder if you could talk about the kind of the overall ecological impact and importance of the Chinook salmon as a a flagship species of the river system, but also the boreal forest.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the most amazing facts about Chinook that perhaps encapsulates just how important they are is that if you do isotopic research into boreal forest tree species, so spruce and other species that line the banks, you find the nitrogen isotopes that come from Chinook salmon, because one of the major things that they do in their life cycle is bring the nutrients of the Bering Sea, thousands of kilometers inland to ecosystems that otherwise don't have access to them. So they're absolutely critical to the sort of basic ecological function of this entire ecosystem. In a way that's difficult to underestimate. We sort of don't know what a Yukon River watershed looks like if it does not have the nitrogen that fish carry up and give not just to the plants, but also to the kind of entire food web, from very small, invertebrates in the stream systems all the way up through bears and eagles and the kind of wildlife that we like to have in our calendars. So they're truly critical in that sense. And the kind of ability for these fish to maintain this nutrient cycle is really fundamental to the functioning of the river biologically and culturally.
Thank you. I feel like this is a question for Chief Pitka, and I feel like I'm asking this on behalf of Mr. Small, who's not currently on the committee. But could you talk about seal predation and whether that is an issue that affects West Coast salmon species at all?
I'm not really sure. The place where we live on the Yukon River is so far in the interior, we don't actually get seals, so I really don't know enough information to answer that.
Does anyone have information to answer that? Because I know it's a question that has been brought up. Ms. DeMuth.
I've never heard seals identified on the Alaska side. There has been discussion of beluga whale, who spend a lot of time down by the mouth of the Yukon and certainly eat salmon. My understanding is that they are not at the level that has been discussed on the Canadian coast, however.
Thank you. Let's put that one to rest.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. I'm sure Mr. Small will be delighted to know you brought up seals and not sea lice. So we'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses here.
Okay. One second,
should I be
now, Ms.
pausing?
Barron. I'll
Yes.
check something, 'cause, well, actually, that's the 30-minute bell, so we'll certainly get in the last of our, if everyone is in agreement, to go to 5:30. 29 minutes left before the vote. So,
25.
yeah. Okay.
Okay.
To you, Ms. Barron.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now I've messed up my time here. Let's just reset. There we go. So thank you to the witnesses. I was just reflecting on the fact that I wish that our witnesses were spread out over multiple meetings because there's so much great testimony. It feels very rushed, and it feels like we're not able to really ask the questions to the degree that I would like to. I can't speak on behalf of my committee members, but for that, it's unfortunate. I do want to reiterate, please send along written information. I know the chair will say that, but I hope that I can pick from the written components to support the recommendations moving forward. There's been so much great testimony that has been provided, and Chief Pitka, you talked about the importance of subsistence harvesting and being told that despite accounting for less than 1% of the statewide harvesting, that this was where the finger was being pointed around where the problem lied. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that and how important it is to have that traditional knowledge when making decisions on how to best move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the total harvest take on the Chinook salmon in the Yukon River has traditionally been 25% of the Canadian harvest share for the United States for the upper Yukon River. And historically, it's such a low number. And it's been about 10 years since we have made the adequate need for subsistence that we need. It's an actual state computation on the State of Alaska website. They have all of that information readily available there, but I can send some more written testimony around it in more detail, because I could go on for 16 hours and you have about 29 minutes. The traditional knowledge around that is that we only take what we need on the Yukon River, especially for our subsistence fishermen. Our traditional ways of life have been greatly challenged by the lack of fish. And so part of our knowledge around, I guess, around the fisheries and the challenges around it has been that it's never been our harvest that's been the culprit, that's been the problem. It's always been outside influences, whether it is regulations or lack of salmon due to climate change, or in the 1900s when they actually put a net across the Yukon River so nobody could get fish. It's always been outside people who have impacted our harvest greatly. And it's been a note of contention. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Ms. DeMuth, I believe the words that you used here, so I can't read my own writing, one of the words in here, but you were talking about old tools being used and the problems with these old tools being used. I believe you said that it leads to invasive harvesting, but that's the word I can't quite differentiate that I wrote down. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you were speaking to when you spoke to that in your testimony?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, because I had to rush that at the end. What I was referring to is I think the design of the Yukon River panel, which is, as you know, many people have spoken here, been quite effective at bringing the United States and Canada together and bringing First Nations and Alaska Native voices to the discussion, is also designed in a way where it regulates salmon only within the Yukon River itself, rather than having jurisdiction and a kind of remit over the ocean where they spend so much of their lives. So that the Yukon River panel can do everything it possibly can, and is in many cases within the river system itself, but where the Yukon River salmon spend so much of their lives is in the oceans, and therefore, are subject to other kinds of regulation or lack of regulation, as the case may be, in that space.
Great.
Does that clarify?
Yes, it does clarify. Thank you, and I'll update my notes accordingly. My next question was, I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more on what you were referencing around the bycatch, what you're seeing, and perhaps some solutions that you can see around that issue.
Sure, and I'm sure that the other panelists here can also speak to this. The issue of bycatch primarily has to do with the pollock fishery, which is a large-scale trawling fishery in the Bering Sea that removes about 3 billion pounds of pollock per year. That's just the pollock. That's actually not counting the various other species that get caught up in the process. That includes lots of other kinds of fish. It sometimes includes orca. And it is a very invasive fishery from a biological standpoint. And like most fisheries, it's regulated and assessed on whether or not the single species that it harvests is sustainable. So yes, you can take 3 billion pounds of pollock a year out of the Bering Sea, and you will have 3 billion pounds next year, but it does not assess the Bering Sea as an ecological space. And that means that fish like salmon can get caught up in it literally as bycatch when they're hauled in with the nets for pollock. That process has been improved in the past 15 years, where there's kind of more emphasis on not catching Chinook in particular. There are also lots of reports of that monitoring process being less than perfect. And it also does not account for the ways in which that fishery changes the entire Bering Sea ecosystem more generally, in ways that are compounding the climate change issue for the sort of success of Chinook when they're at sea.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Barron, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing their valuable information with the committee as we work our way through this study. That kind of concludes everything. I just want to remind everyone that we approved a motion today that February 27th and 29th would be the study that was referenced by Madam Debian. But I'd like to carve off some time in that first meeting for committee business, even 45 minutes. Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I recognize Ms. Debian had some urgency around her study. Mr. Perkins' motion that we look at the Elver fishery because of the timeline of when that season was to open. There's only apparently 10 days of consultation taking place right now on that. I think we need to have discussion amongst the committee as to what comes first before we.
Okay, but like I said, we've already approved the 27th and the 29th. But what I'd like to do is, if we could take 45 minutes of the 27th to discuss that very issue and the schedule going forward, say the last 45 minutes, and if we need a little bit of extra time, maybe we can rob a little bit of 15 minutes or something added on if we can, if there's nothing pressing behind us. So we'll do it that way. And because I do know that the motion included the 27th, 29th. Madam Debian, quickly, please. What did that mean?
No translation. Je profite pour remercier notre service d'interprétation qui est vraiment merveilleux. Merci beaucoup. Je trouve ça long, 40.
I find that very long, 45 minutes, because in the context of my time that we'll do that, could that be maybe shortened to 15 minutes?
But we've got yours to deal with, which we know is the 27th, 29th, but we got to know what's coming next, because Ms. Barron had a motion there. Mr. Arnold indicated that he wants to discuss the Elver fishery, and of course we still have the Yukon study that's on the go as well. So I don't know if we'll use as little time as possible for committee business, but if we could start, because your motion indicated the 27th, we have to start on the 27th and the 29th. That was in your motion. Yes, Mr. Cormier, quickly, please.
So, Mr. Chair, I think if you read the motion of Ms. Debian very carefully, it said 27 for 2 hours, 29 for 2 hours.
Yes.
So this is what we vote on that, and I
Okay.
think we should respect that.
Okay.
And the bells are ringing, so.
Yeah, and if I can find some extra time onto one of the meetings, we'll do some committee business. Ms. Barron, quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say, I don't know if it's actually necessary as well, because we do already know the line of an order of where the studies are happening. If there's an additional motion to come forward, then it can come forward for us to debate. But I don't know if we really need time to go through, and we already know the order of studies as listed.
Mr. Hanley, quickly, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was so excited about salmon. I forgot to ask during my speaking time for consent of the committee to resubmit the travel submission that we had previously submitted. This is for as part of the Yukon study. It's already been all costed out. It was.
You're determined to try it again.
I'm determined to try it again if the committee would support the travel submission.
I'm not seeing any no's, so that'll be submitted again, Mr. Hanley, at your leisure. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you to our clerk, our analysts, and of course our translation team, and of course the team at the tables that make it possible for this meeting to take place each and every day. Yes, Madam Debian.
Comment on peut...
How could we make sure that the minister would be there on the 27th? Will that just follow its course?